start the recording. Got my screen shared. Okay, I think this is as far as we made it last time. So we're talking about a bunch of stuff. So we started with the voyages of discovery last time, and we got into the Reformation. We're going to speak more about the Reformation today, and then at the end of the chapter, I'm not going to spend a lot of time on it, but we're going to kind of go around the world and check in on different places and talk about what's going on in places in Europe, places in Asia, and then I think we're going to talk about Africa in the next chapter, maybe. So, anyway, let's finish up with the Reformation. And we didn't get to the spread of the Reformation, did we? Okay, so this is new stuff. So, um, we said that the Reformation, of course, Martin Luther begins in what is modern day Germany. Eventually, it's going to spread to England. Now, England is not going to be just religious reasons, it's also going to spread for political reasons. And there's going to be a lot of stuff tied up in with the English Reformation. The English Reformation. And we'll talk about the spread of the Reformation uh, a little bit more in other places. But England is kind of unique because it's not just religious reasons. And maybe I shouldn't say it's unique because it does happen in other places. But it spreads for both religious and political reasons. And it all has to do with this guy, Henry VIII. Henry VIII has a problem. He is the King of England, but he needs an heir. He needs a son so that when he dies, he knows that his dynasty will continue. Well, Henry is married to a Spanish princess, Catherine of Aragon, or she is from Aragon, but not the Catherine of Aragon. She's the daughter of Ferdinand and Isabella. So anyway, okay, fine. He's married to Catherine, and Catherine just will not give him a son. Now, of course, we know modern biology, it's not her fault, but that was the thinking back then. That Catherine will not give him a son, and so he wants to get out of the marriage and marry someone else, presumably someone who will give him a son. Here's the problem. Remember that virtually everyone in Europe at this time is a Catholic, and the Catholic Church does not grant divorces. It's not a thing. You can't get divorced, it's not an option. But you can get an annulment, and an annulment is different than a divorce. A divorce says we were married and now we're not. An annulment says we were never married to begin with because there was something wrong with the marriage. There was some fatal flaw from the beginning that we were never actually married. And old Hank thinks he has a pretty good argument. You see, he's not Catherine's first husband. Henry was actually the second son. He was never supposed to be king. The older son was supposed to be king. His name was Arthur. And so England and Spain got together and they made this deal. The Spanish princess would marry the English prince, and that would kind of bond, the two countries together. So Catherine married Arthur, but then he died almost immediately. There was unfortunately no King Arthur. He died almost immediately, but because this marriage was made for diplomatic reasons, they said, well, one king of England is as good as the other one. Let's just marry her off to Henry. And so that's what happened. Now, I forget the exact passage, but somewhere in the Bible it says that the widow should not marry her husband's brother or something like that. It's not allowed. And so Henry says, "Listen, I need an out. I've got an out. She was my brother's widow. I was never actually supposed to be able to marry her. This marriage was doomed from the beginning." Well, if you are the King of England, you can't just go down to your local parish priest and ask for an annulment. You have to go to the top. You got to go to the Pope. Well, the Pope at this time, I forget who it was, but the Pope at this time, I believe, was Catherine's uncle. And so he did not want to see her good name sort of dragged through the mud by granting this annulment. So he said, no, I'm not going to grant you this annulment. Should have been moving, sorry. So the Pope says, no, I'm not going to grant you this annulment. And Henry is really upset because he really wants a son. And he also wants to marry his mistress. So, okay, fine. So he says, okay, the head of the church will not grant me an annulment. I'm going to start my own church. He says England is no longer a Catholic country. We no longer recognize the authority of the Pope. I'm going to start my own church. I'm going to call it the Church of England. And guess who's going to be at the top of the Church of England? The King of England. So he goes to himself and he says, hey, I want an annulment. And he says, sure, you bet. And so he's able to get his marriage to Catherine annulled. The Act in Restraint of Appeals and the Supremacy Act. You don't have to remember all that stuff. Just remember, he creates his own church because he couldn't get a divorce. Sometimes you will see it referred to as the Anglican Church. That's also the Church of England. And the King of England is at the head. Now, here's the important part. Well, that's important, but here's the interesting thing. The Church of England is very, very similar to the Catholic Church. They keep the same Bible, they keep the same teachings, they keep all the same rituals. It's just instead of having the Pope at the head, you have the King of England at the head. And in fact, there were rumors that Henry considered himself to be a Catholic until, he died. But for all extents and purposes, England has left the Catholic Church, and they are now a Protestant nation. They are now a Protestant nation. And of course, Henry goes on to marry the mistress, Anne Boleyn. What happens to Anne Boleyn? Anybody know? He has her executed because she also wasn't able to give him a son. So Catherine gave him a daughter, Mary. Anne Boleyn gives him another daughter, Elizabeth, and then he marries 4 more times. So let's see. Anne Boleyn, who he had executed, he marries Jane Seymour next, who does give him a son, Edward, but she dies in childbirth. He marries Anne of Cleves, who survives him, Catherine Howard, who he had executed, and then Catherine Parr, who survives him. So, if you were looking to get married to Henry VIII, your odds, the odds were against you. Half of them ended up dead or executed. But he does finally get his son in Edward. Okay, so he gets his annulment, marries Anne Boleyn, and then he marries a bunch more women. And he ends up with 3 children, Edward, Mary, and Elizabeth. Okay, but here's the real question. Whatever the king decides is the religion is the religion. It's that way in basically every country. And so if you're looking to convert a country over to a new religion, you go right to the top. You go to the king, and if you can convince him, then the rest of the country has to follow suit. But these people have been Catholic their entire lives. Do the English, the everyday run-of-the-mill, your average everyday English citizen, did they buy into this idea of that they are no longer Catholic and now they are Protestant? Well, we don't really know. There aren't a whole lot of records, but you would have to assume that they really didn't buy into it, right? I mean, they were Catholic. They woke up one day and they're no longer Catholic. Yesterday they were, and today they're not. They've been Catholic their entire lives. Their fathers and mothers were Catholics. Their grandparents were Catholics. And now all of a sudden, because the king wants to get his marriage ended, they're no longer Catholic. You would have to assume that the buy-in from the average everyday person doesn't really work. You have to assume that there's going to be some pushback just because the king decided that the country was no longer going to be Catholic one day. But we don't know that for certain. There's certainly not a lot of records, and there's going to be a lot of religious strife after. See, the problem is Henry was a Protestant. When he dies, Edward becomes king. He's a Protestant. But Mary is a devout Catholic. And so she's actually going to, after Edward dies without a kid, Mary is going to take over as queen, and she is going to go around persecuting Protestants. In fact, this is the Bloody Mary of your childhood urban legend, right? The reason she's known as Bloody Mary is because she killed so many Protestants. And then after Mary dies, Elizabeth becomes queen, and Elizabeth is a Protestant. So you can see it kind of, they're Catholic, now they're Protestant, now they're Catholic, it flip-flops. So for For several years, England is a very unsettled place. Now, once Elizabeth takes over, of course, she is queen for forever and a day. She has a very long, very stable reign, and she will actually bring England into a very prominent place in Europe. But until Elizabeth gets there, England's a pretty messed up place. All right, Reformation in France. The guy I want you to know in France is John Calvin. John Calvin. And Calvin is a major player in the Protestant Reformation. We've spoken about Martin Luther. We've mentioned very briefly Zwingli, but the big three: Luther, Zwingli, and this guy, John Calvin. He is going to be incredibly popular and incredibly influential. You don't really have to remember his kind of big masterpiece was the Institutes of the Christian Religion. He does have a big impact on Geneva. He kind of envisioned Geneva as the city on the hill. He wanted to mold it into a model Christian city. He doesn't necessarily succeed, but at least that's his goal. I do want you to know about his views on predestination, though, the doctrine of predestination, which is something that's not unique to Calvinists, uh, not just unique to Christians either. There are other religions. Islam, for example, Islam has a very strong belief in predestination, but Calvinists do as well, and they're not the only Christians that believe this. The idea behind predestination is that God, the Christian God, God big G, is omniscient. He knows everything, right? He contains all knowledge, and that includes the knowledge of whether or not you, as an individual soul, are going to heaven or hell. God is omniscient. He knows everyone that has ever lived and will ever live. And there's a giant book of life where everyone who has ever lived or will ever live, their name is written down, and then out beside it there's a smiley face or a frowny face, right? He's omniscient. He knows what's going to happen before it happens, and that includes whether or not you're going to heaven or hell. Which really brings up a lot of questions of free will, right? If it's already known, if it's already determined, uh, does that mean that you can control anything in your life? That's above my pay grade. But that's one of the key tenets of Calvinism. Now here's the tricky part. If if it's already set in stone and there's nothing you can do to change it, you can just do whatever, right? Um, you can live your life however you want to, and it's not going to change anything because it's already been predetermined. Well, Calvin would argue that a sign of whether or not you were going to heaven or hell was if you lived a good life. Because it was very easy to tell if you were living a bad life, well, then yeah, you're going to hell. But if you were living a good life, that's a good indication that you were probably going to heaven. So it wasn't an excuse. You couldn't just do whatever you wanted to do. But that was the idea. God was omniscient. He already knew what was going to happen to you, before you even existed. Okay. While all this is going by, while all this is happening, the Catholic Church is not just sitting around doing nothing. Martin Luther, Zwingli, Calvin, they have raised very real and very deep questions about the teachings of the Catholic Church. And the Catholic Church is going to take a long, hard look at itself and say, is there any truth to these claims? And it turns out that, yeah, the medieval church had some problems. And they're going to try to fix them. It's known as the Catholic Reformation, or sometimes you might see it referred to as the Counter Reformation. Pope Paul III, he is the everything that the medieval popes were not. If the medieval popes were men of the world who lusted after material wealth, Pope Paul III, he was a good pope. He was a model pope. He was everything a pope was supposed to be. He says we need to champion moral standards. We need to increase education of the clergy. We need to get rid of these practices of pluralism and absenteeism where people hold more than one church office and then they don't actually do the jobs they're supposed to do. He is trying to lead the Catholic Church to a better place. That's the Catholic Reformation, the acknowledgement that sure, the medieval church had problems and we need to try to fix them. The Catholic Reformation or the Counter Reformation. Everybody good? Which brings us to the Council of Trent. The Catholic Church sat down with the leading Protestant leaders. They sat down with the Lutherans. They sat down with the Calvinists, the Wesleyans, and the Baptists, whoever. They all sit down, and this isn't like a weekend conference. They sit down for years. It lasted from 1545 until 1563. They sat down with the Protestant leaders and they said, okay, let's try to come to an agreement. You guys have said that you have these problems with the church, and we acknowledge that. We've been working on that. We don't want the church to be split. We don't want the church to be fractured. Let's sit down and see if we can't come to an agreement. Let's try to talk this out. Let's try to work this out. And of course, they couldn't. They didn't. In the end, the Catholic Church and the Protestants simply could not come to an agreement. The Catholic Church said, no, we just don't agree with what you're preaching. And of course, that split is still there today. So you have the original split between the Western Church and the Eastern Church. And now you have the split within the Western Church, the Reformation, which, again, Protestants, all different flavors of Protestants. You look at any small town in America, right? There's a Baptist church and a Methodist church and a Church of Christ and so forth and so on. Those are all Protestant denominations. It did solve some problems. They do make some changes. They're not able to come to an agreement. They're not able to reconcile with one another. But they do come up with some stricter rules, and they do come up with some reforms that make people happier with the Catholic Church. We also see new religious orders that come out around this time. Ignatius Loyola is the founder of the Society of Jesus, better known as the Jesuits. The Jesuits are a major organization within the Catholic Church. Even today, they're very influential, very powerful. They become known for their commitment to education. They become advisors to kings and queens all over the Catholic world. It's not just the Jesuits, though. We also see some of those other groups that I was talking about, like the Ursuline nuns. It's an attempt to reform the image of the medieval church. It's an attempt to maybe get in better contact with people after the problems of the medieval church. So we do see new religious organizations sort of spring up within the Catholic Church. Okay, that's fine. Let's talk about the political impact of the Reformation. Because this is not just like we saw in England, this is not just a spiritual question. This is also going to bleed over into your everyday life. This is going to impact the running of governments in Europe during the Reformation. This guy is Charles V. And in 1519, right when all this was kind of kicking off, Charles V is elected the Holy Roman Emperor. The Holy Roman Empire is kind of this weird political organization. Most of like modern day Germany and Austria, kind of Central Europe. But I say elected because this was not an inherited position. It has all these like different princes. And whenever the emperor died, all the princes got together and they voted on who wanted to be the next Holy Roman Emperor. So, okay, fine. He is elected Holy Roman Emperor. He's also a member of the House of Habsburg. And this is where most of his power actually comes from. The Holy Roman Empire, yeah, it's a big deal. But the fact that Charles V was already the head of the House of Habsburg makes him an incredibly powerful individual. In fact, he ruled about half of Europe. You can see on this map here, this kind of light yellow area, that's modern day Germany and Austria moving into modern day Poland. He controls the Low Countries, the Netherlands up here, chunks of Italy, especially southern Italy, Corsica, and Sicily. He also rules Spain. And because he rules Spain, that also includes off map everything in the New World. Remember, this is 1519 after Columbus has discovered the New World. He also has all the Spanish colonial possessions over in the New World. An incredibly powerful individual. Somebody once asked him, how do you manage to rule over all of these lands? I've always liked his answer. He says, I speak Spanish to God, Italian to women, French to men, and German to my horse. He left his horse. Head of the House of Habsburg. Incredibly influential, but his number one job is the Holy Roman Emperor, that is modern day Germany, exactly where Martin Luther began the Reformation. So he has to deal personally with Martin Luther and uh, the consequences of the Protestant Reformation. Charles V is a devout Catholic. And so the nobles of the Holy Roman Empire that wanted more power for themselves, they said, hey, this is an opportunity. You know, there's always a struggle between the king, who has the power, and his nobles, who have a little bit of power, but they always want more, right? It's the same thing with the Holy Roman Empire. He's the king, but all of his nobles, they want even more power, and now they say, we've got an excuse. Because this is no longer just a political struggle. Now we can use religion. If we convert over to Protestantism, we can use that as an excuse to attack the emperor. We're supposed to be loyal, right? We're supposed to be good, loyal nobles and support our emperor. But he's a Catholic. And if we become Protestant, that gives us an excuse to sort of rise up in rebellion. That's exactly what happens. We are going to see war and violence sweep through Switzerland and Germany. And again, these nobles are rising up in revolt using religion as a springboard. And maybe some of them really believed it. Maybe some of them just saw a convenient excuse to fuel their rebellion. And eventually, even Charles V, who was maybe the most powerful person, certainly in Europe, maybe on the planet at that time, even he is forced to concede. I can't stop the Reformation, no matter how many wars, no matter how many people are killed. I can't stop it. I've got to accept that Lutheranism, that the Protestant denominations are here to stay. It's known as the Peace of Augsburg. That's, you don't have to remember it for the test, but it's Augsburg, Augsburg. Charles V sits down with the Lutheran leaders and says, okay, you win, no more fighting, I will accept your existence. Eventually, he has to accept Lutheranism as a viable religion. We see problems in France. France is a devoutly Catholic country, but the Reformation is going to take hold there as well. The French Protestants were known as Huguenots. Huguenots. And in an event known as the St. Bartholomew Days Massacre, thousands of French Huguenots are going to be put to death. They're going to be rounded up and killed by French Catholics. Killed by French Catholics. Well, while this is happening, there's actually already a plan to bridge the divide between Protestants and Catholics. Henry was engaged to I believe it was the king's sister. Henry is a Protestant. The king's sister was a Catholic. And again, their marriage is supposed to symbolize, a peace between these two groups of people. Well, when the St. Bartholomew Days massacre occurs, Henry realizes that that's not going to work. And he decides to convert over to Catholicism. His famous quote is, "Paris is worth a mass," basically saying it's worth converting to Catholicism if I get to be king of France. And that's exactly what happens. He becomes Henry IV. But when he becomes king, he still wants to look out for his fellow Protestants. He issues the Edict of Nantes, which allows, just like the Peace of Augsburg did, it says that Protestants are allowed to live in France. Edict of Nantes. Henry, a former Protestant himself, said, I will protect, my fellow Huguenots and make sure that they are taken care of. All right. We see more war because of the Reformation. When Charles V decided to stop being emperor, he didn't die. He willingly gave up the throne for his son. The Netherlands saw their chance. The Netherlands had long been uh, very fertile ground for Protestant thought. Charles was a devout Catholic, but the Netherlands were Calvin was very, very popular in the Netherlands. And so as soon as Charles stepped down, they said, all right, now's our chance. And they began declaring themselves, we're going to be Protestant. Well, the guy who followed Charles, his son, I think his name was Philip, said, no, you're not. And it was basically a civil war. The Protestants in the Low Countries, the Netherlands, fighting against the Habsburgs. Well, the Netherlands are small. They don't have a lot of resources. They know if they're going to have any shot at winning this war against the Spanish, they're going to need friends. They're going to need Protestant friends. Well, who's the biggest Protestant country at that time? Well, it's their next door neighbor, England. That's Elizabeth I. And so the Spanish say, okay, we've had enough. England has been a thorn in our side for years. They've got this Protestant pretender on the throne. They need a good, strong Catholic monarch. We're going to deal with this once and for all. We're going to invade England. We're going to take Elizabeth off the throne. We're going to get rid of her, this Protestant queen, and we're going to put a good Catholic king back on the throne of England, like it ought to be. And so in order to accomplish this, They gathered together the largest navy the world had ever seen. Remember, this is Spain at the height of its colonial empire. Spain is the richest country in Europe by far. They're filthy, stinking rich. And here's England, a relatively poor island nation. They have no chance of standing up against the Spanish. This Spanish Armada is going to sweep in, destroy the English Navy. They're going to invade England. They're going to get rid of their queen and put a Catholic back on the throne of England. That doesn't happen. You can see in this picture why. On the left-hand side, you see here the English ships sailing in nice weather and bright sunlight. And then over here, you see what happens to the Spanish Armada. On the right-hand side, they get caught in a storm, and the entire fleet is wrecked. England sees this as divine favor, right? That God has interceded, and he sent this storm, and he approves of what we're doing. This accomplishes two things. Number one, it sort of breaks the Spanish back because they never really recover from losing this huge fleet that they put together. And then the other thing is, you can't really see it, but Queen Elizabeth is sitting with her hand on a globe, and if you can tell, her hand is resting on North America. Now that the Spanish Armada is no longer a threat, now that Spain has been, kind of set back, this is going to open up North America for English settlement. They hadn't done it so far because they were afraid of running into the Spanish. But now they don't have that worry, and they can start colonies in North America, which eventually, of course, become the United States. So without the fall of the Spanish Armada, we being the United States, might very well not exist. That's cool. Also led to the 30 Years' War. All right, if you don't get the trend by now, the Protestant Reformation, being a spiritual event, yeah, has a lot to do with churches and what people believe and what Bible they're reading. Okay, fine. Also leads to a lot of death, a lot of violence. Protestants and Catholics, they're killing each other by the boatload. There's no telling how many thousands and tens of thousands of people have died through the years in these religious wars. And it doesn't even end. I mean, the so-called troubles in Ireland between North Ireland and the Republic of Ireland, right? That has a religious underpinning between Catholicism and Protestant. I mean, this stuff still continues even today. Now, the one thing I do want you to know about the 30 Years' War is the Peace of Westphalia, because the Peace of Westphalia really was the first modern peace treaty. The Peace of Westphalia was the first modern peace treaty and really sort of outlines the way that quote unquote modern Europe would operate. It essentially establishes a balance of power. And the idea is that as long as that balance was maintained, everybody would be all right. If you've got three different countries, A, B, and C, and they're all relatively equal and the status quo is kept, there's going to be peace. But what happens if one of those countries, let's say A, B, and C, country A begins growing in power and begins acting more aggressively? What are B and C going to do? Well, yeah, but do they want to do that? So what are they going to do? Right. And what are they going to try to go at it separately? No, they're going to team up, right? And that's how the balance of power operates. Anytime one country begins acting out, acting aggressively, begins taking more land, the other countries are going to kind of band up and bring them back down to the status quo. I mean, I'm not saying that every country is equal, because certainly they're not. But as long as that status quo is maintained, there will be peace. And the Peace of Westphalia worked for 100 years. Okay. Let's talk about some of these different countries. And again, you don't necessarily have to write down everything that's on the slide. We're just going to kind of touch and see what's kind of going on around the world. The first place I want to talk about is the Netherlands, because they do have a lot of influence. The Netherlands, the so-called Low Countries, are a relatively small part of Europe. They're right here in Northern Europe. They're known as the Low Countries because literally they're low, like they're at sea level. In fact, that's why you see pictures of windmills. That's why they're so famous for their windmills, is because they use these windmills to run giant pumps to drain ocean water off of their land. They didn't have enough land to grow food, so they built these huge systems of dams and dikes. They built these huge windmills to pump water off of this very low land, the Low Countries, to give them more room so they could grow food for their people. So they're a relatively small country, but they have large holdings all over the world. Over here in North America, we see the colony of New Amsterdam, which is modern day New York. They have holdings in South America. They have a few holdings in Africa. Can't see it, but specifically South Africa. But then in Asia, the Dutch East Indies, or the Dutch West Indies, yeah, the Dutch East Indies, modern day Indonesia. And they got a lot of, for being a relatively small, resource poor European country, they have a lot of influence, mostly because of their colonies overseas. They are run by these two sort of state run companies, the Dutch East India Company and the Dutch West India Company. Very active in the Caribbean. They do have holdings in the Caribbean. Okay, fine. The Dutch. All right. Let's talk about France. One thing that I want you to know about France, because this will come up later when we're talking about the French Revolution, is this idea of absolutism. Absolutism can also be defined as the divine right of kings. And this is something that kings have used to justify their rule for thousands of years. Because it's a good question. What makes that guy king and I'm just some ordinary Joe? What makes him so special? Why does he get to be king and, I have to go out and work in the fields every day? Well, the king would argue, I have the divine right of kings. And what he means by that is, I was chosen by God to be king. That could be part of it, yeah. That could certainly be used as an excuse. And in fact, that was used at least a couple of times over in Asia. They have something sort of similar to, I mean, they weren't Christians, obviously. Um, but whenever a natural disaster befell the people, you could say, well, obviously somebody's unhappy with you. We need to change. And so, yeah, that could absolutely be used as an excuse. But here's the thing. If you're saying that I am king because a God, or the God, God big G, has chosen me to be king, that means I speak with his authority. And you can't question anything I say. I am an absolute ruler. And my word is law. That was what the French believed. The French kings thought that they were absolute rulers chosen by God to rule over the French people. All right, well, Henry IV, whom we've already mentioned, he died, and Louis XIII becomes king. Well, Louis XIII was just a kid. And so he had to have a regent. He had to have someone to help him rule. Louis was king, but he's just a little kid. He needs someone to help him until he grows up. And that regent, that helper, was Cardinal Richelieu. Does that name sound familiar to anyone? He's a famous character in a book. Alexander Dumas? Anyone? Anyone ever seen the Three Musketeers? Athos, Porthos, Aramis? No? Disney movie. So anyway, yeah, well, it doesn't matter to you guys. Cardinal Richelieu was the bad guy. Cardinal Richelieu, obviously, he's a very high member of the Catholic Church. And so Louis the 13th, as he grows up, is going to be very hostile to Protestants. Okay, fine, fair enough. Then comes Louis the 14th. And this is the big one. Louis the 14th became king in 1651. He lived for like another 200 years. He was king forever. That's not really right, but he was one of the longest reigning monarchs in European history. He was king of France for forever. And under his leadership, France becomes incredibly wealthy and incredibly powerful, incredibly influential. In fact, he himself was known as Le Roi Soleil, the Sun King, because France was seen as the center of the universe and everything revolved around France. Louis the 14th is going to be king of France during some very important things, like the 7 Years' War. We'll talk about that in just a minute. But I want you to know that Louis the 14th really sort of sets the stage for the French Revolution, 100 years later, 150 years later. Because he's going to push France so hard that they gain so much land. It just really sort of becomes unstable. And as a result of his actions, like I say, in another 100, 150 years, France is going to undergo some pretty major events because of some of the instabilities that he introduced. And yeah, France grew and it prospered, and everybody looked up to France, and France was incredibly influential. But because he pushed it so hard, because they grew so much, it really became unstable, and that's going to lead to problems later on down the road. All right, so absolutism. I am king because God has willed it to me, and I speak with his absolute authority. Different situation over in England. They believe in constitutionalism. What is a constitution? Let me ask you this. Do we have a constitution? Yes. What is the United States Constitution? It's a set. That's an excellent It's a set of laws that everyone has to follow. Well, that's exactly what it is. Constitutionalism means that you do not believe in the divine right of kings. You do not believe in absolute rulers. They are limited by law. This is a very old, established practice in Great Britain, going all the way back to the 1200s, where the nobles forced the king to sign what was known as the Magna Carta. That's Latin for Great Charter, in which the king basically gave up his absolute authority. He used to be an absolute ruler, but England kind of fell on hard times, and King John, like Robin Hood, the bad guy in Robin Hood, was so weak that the nobles were able to force him to sign the Magna Carta, in which he gave up some of his powers. So Great Britain believes in constitutionalism. They have to live under a set of laws. Now, England, just like Spain, just like France, will also have an overseas empire. But I want you to know that the English empire is a commercial empire. They buy and sell stuff. all over the world. England will have a huge empire. In fact, there's an old saying, the sun never sets on the British Empire, because literally the sun was shining on some British soil all over the world at any point in the day. They had England, they had holdings, of course, in North America, the American colonies, they had holdings in the Caribbean, they had holdings in Africa, they had holdings in Asia. They owned Egypt and India and Hong Kong. Literally, the sun was always shining somewhere on British soil. Huge commercial buying and selling stuff all over the world, incredibly wealthy for a very small, island nation. The English grow to be world dominators, and we'll talk more about that later. They do run into a little bit of trouble, and we'll talk about the American Revolution a little bit later on. But yeah, they got to fight the 7 Years' War, and then of course the War of American Independence. So they do have some issues here and there. But still, they're incredibly powerful, incredibly wealthy, and as they move from the 1600s into the 1700s into the 1800s and beyond, they're going to be incredibly powerful and influential. Let's talk about Russia. Russia was settled by Vikings, which is just cool in and of itself. But in 1549, the leader of Russia, Ivan IV, also known as Ivan the Terrible, is going to come up with a new name for himself, a new title. He's going to crown himself the prince of all Russia's Tsar. Sometimes you will spell this Czar, Czar. Now, I've always thought that this was a cool title because it directly comes from the old Roman title of Caesar. Julius Caesar, of course, major figure in the Roman Republic. He Julius Caesar never actually becomes emperor. He's killed before he can do that. But the rulers that follow Julius Caesar actually take his name as a form of their title. So the guy that comes after Julius Caesar is Augustus Caesar. He takes Caesar's name as his title. That's where Tsar comes from. Russia was saying we're actually uh, the descendants of Russia, and in fact, Moscow is known as the Third Rome. And there's actually some logic behind this. Back after the fall of the Roman Empire, a series of Roman princesses of Roman nobility had actually married into the Russian nobility. And so they actually had kind of a claim that they were the descendant, they were the inheritors of the old Roman Empire. And in fact, if you look at it, the things they chose as their like imperial sigils. So the double-headed eagle, that was a Roman thing that the Russians took for themselves. So anyway, it's kind of cool. Um, Tsar has links back to Caesar, and in fact, the German emperor Kaiser is also a form of Caesar. So this guy's name becomes synonymous with emperor. Pretty cool. So the Russian leader I really want you to remember is Peter the First, also known as Peter the Great. And Peter's got a problem. Russia is huge. Even today, it's the world's largest country. I think that's right. It's either Russia or Canada. I think it's Russia. Geographically, Russia is huge, stretches from Europe all the way across the Eurasian plate over into Asia, has a large population, has lots of resources, but it's kind of backwards. It's seen as the people are as seen as uneducated and unsophisticated. And Russia, for being, they call themselves the Third Rome. They're really kind of backwards. And Peter wants to change that. Peter the Great wants to change that. He has a plan. he goes on this tour of Western European countries. He visits England and France and Spain and the Holy Roman Empire. And, he's taking notes and he says, oh, well, that's cool. I want to bring that back. And that's awesome. I want to bring that back. And so when he gets back to Russia, he's got all these notes and all these plans. And he basically publishes them and says, okay, we're going to do it this way now. All of your, traditional Russian beliefs, we're getting rid of them and we're going to modernize. And so he tells the people, you can no longer drink alcohol. You got to shave your beards. You can't wear traditional Russian, clothing anymore. You got to dress in European style suits. We're going to change everything about the country overnight, and we're going to modernize Russia. Well, as you might expect, that the people don't really like that very much. And he has some good ideas. He wants to bring in modern architecture and he wants to bring in new methods of building ships and all that sort of stuff. But he tries to basically reinvent Russian culture. And in fact, he goes to a big swamp and he says, build me a capital city, build me a new place to live. Thousands upon thousands of people die. They try to change their agricultural techniques. They can't grow enough food. And so, yeah, he drags Russia into the future, but he sort of drags them kicking and screaming. That's not what they wanted to do. All right, we'll stop there for the day. We're not going to finish. So we'll go ahead and stop. So when we come back on Thursday, we'll finish up 14 very briefly, and then we'll get into chapter 15. And then we'll talk about the study guides, and I'll try to get up that quiz this afternoon. It'll be due Sunday at midnight. And I will see you guys on Thursday.